Oh, I love it. It's amazing. Like, I know now with the COVID restrictions, it feels a bit different, but for someone who's new to Hong Kong, even now it feels just so vibrant. Like I love seeing people around. There's all this bustling, there's, this energy, just also amazing food. I am a big foodie, so I just love going to restaurants and it's amazing here. Boston just feels like relatively small compared. Feels almost a little bit more like a small town by comparison. And I grew up in Switzerland, so there, we're talking about really small towns. But no, it's amazing to be here. This is my first year teaching it, and it's actually a completely new course. So I'm happy to tell you a bit about my major, but maybe I should tell you a little bit about the class to give you some sense of like how this comes about. So when I got hired here, the department sent me a couple of courses and they said, oh, are any of these things you would be interested in teaching? And so I saw this individual, like the ethics class, and I was like, oh, individual ethics, that sounds really interesting. I kind of wish I knew more about this. And as I always tell in my class, right, the way you can learn a topic is when you have to teach it. Because it kind of forces you to really try and understand the material. And so I thought, well, I mean, I've taken a philosophy class before, but I don't actually know all that much about ethics. Let me go and figure out, what I want to teach about this. And what makes the class really fun is that we actually have a lot of freedom in terms of how we teach it. So if you take Management 2010 with one of the other amazing faculty, you're going to have a very different experience because they're going to teach the things that they think are interesting. And so that kind of makes it a really fun class to teach, right? Because it's completely no guardrails. It's, go and teach about the things you think are interesting. And so I read up, right? I tried to do some readings. I tried to figure out how can you put together a syllabus that's actually going to be interesting. And so every time, right, I teach a class, I kind of look at the material that I think would be interesting. And then sometimes as I'm writing it up, I just get really bored by my own slides. And I just think like, well, this is not fun. Like I'm getting bored. And so if I get bored, then of course all the students will get bored too, right? You didn't get to choose the class. You actually just got assigned to my section. And who comes to a business school trying to study ethics, right? This is like the required class you have to do. So again, if I'm getting bored, then it's completely hopeless. And so I delete a lot of slides. And then I just try to see like, how can I make it more fun? What is sort of a different thing to do? And then I think, if I'm excited about it, there's at least some chance that the students in the class will also be excited about it. And I'm glad to hear that it seems to work, at least for some of you. So that's happy. Again, I'm very happy to hear that it sounds like it's all well planned. It is, very much ad hoc, right? It's sort of trying to see what works, right? And what are sort of the kind of topics we should discuss. And I tried to find other classes. So for those of you who are not in my ethics class, it's really taking a mix of economics and psychology, which is actually what my major used to be and sort of what I'm really interested in studying, and saying, well, let's apply this to ethics. And there's some people who do this, but as far as I know, like I couldn't really find a class to copy, right? I couldn't really look at someone else's syllabus and be like, oh, let's do what these people do. And so, it's sort of a first stab at trying something new. So that's where this class comes about. And I think that's kind of why I enjoy doing it, is because I've learned a lot putting together the slides, which maybe I shouldn't tell my students, but I learned something too. And it's always amazing to hear, have conversations with the class, because then you see where their thinking is going, right? How are they thinking about these sort of big picture issues? And then I learn from that as well. And so I think when you have a dynamic where, you can teach something, but you also learn, that just makes it way more fun. So that's why I'm super excited about doing this. In terms of my major, so in undergraduate, I studied mathematics and economics. That was my major. And then I had a minor in psychology. And so the way that came about was, as I mentioned, I grew up in Switzerland. And in secondary school, we kind of have to choose a major already. And I was really interested in law. not at all economics, right? But if you want to study law, it comes bundled with economics. It's just like a law and economics major. And so I really enjoyed the law part of it. I really didn't like the economics part of it, right? It just seemed kind of abstract, boring. And then I read this one book. It's called Law's Order, What Economics Has to Do with Law and Why It Matters. And the really long title basically tells you exactly what the book is about. But it has all these kind of fun thought examples. One is like, imagine you're a politician and you're trying to set the policy for, like, what should the punishment be for armed robbery, right? And so maybe you want to be really tough on crime. And so you say, oh, it should be life imprisonment. And say you're in a, somewhere, right, where there's no death penalty, life imprisonment is the hardest thing you can give someone. And then the public might say, hey, this is great, like someone's tough on crime, let's do that. But then the economist is going to say, like, well, now you have an incentive to shoot your victims. Right? If you give someone the harshest penalty for doing an armed robbery, they have no disincentive not to kill their victim. So you're potentially making things a lot worse. And in some way, like, that kind of reasoning just seemed like super cool to me, right? I was like, oh, like, I never thought about incentives outside of economics. This is strange, but interesting. And so the whole book is examples like this. And I was like, this is awesome. And then at the same time, it's kind of completely ridiculous that anyone in the middle of a crime would try and reason through, like, what's the probability that I'm going to get arrested? What is the punishment for all the things I could be doing? Like, there's a complete lack of emotion in that analysis, right? Like, if you get mad at someone, you don't, maybe it just feels good to punch them. You don't kind of reason through, like, what are the consequences and all that, right? You don't have time to do it. That's sort of just an emotional thing. And so that's how I got interested in this area of behavioral economics, which is like, oh, how can we enrich these models by actually taking into account people's emotions and psychology? And then, once you take that view, suddenly every kind of human decision-making becomes part of what you study. And in fact, there's research in the field that looks at how pigeons make decisions. And it turns out they're just as impatient as humans are. So potentially, right, it's not even just human behavior that becomes interesting. Now you look at what different animals do. I actually have a paper on how ants make decisions, which you think would be completely, like, out of left field. It was actually super interesting to think about. Maybe a topic for a different interview. But, you can kind of broaden it, right? It can just be like, this seems cool. Like, what can I learn from this? And somehow it becomes part of what you study. Somehow it just, applies to something else. I love this question. I love framing it in terms of, like, the beauty of a major, right? It's kind of like, there's this natural beauty in things that we do. I think it's really often in the small things that you just observe about the world around you. Like, you see things that most people just miss or, think like is irrelevant, right? Like, there's a grocery store, they charge you 50 cents for a plastic bag. And suddenly you're like, oh, that's interesting. The other store I went to gave me a 50-cent discount if I brought my own bag. I wonder if that, makes a difference. Turns out there's actually a paper where people analyzed that, and they showed that charging people 50 cents for using a plastic bag works way better than giving people a 50-cent rebate for bringing their own bag. But economically speaking, right, it's the same thing. It's 50 cents that matter, but having to pay it. So it's just like really small things that you kind of observe all around you, where most people in the world would just think like, oh, whatever, right, it's 50 cents. And you just stop and think like, oh, that's cool. That kind of connects to something else. Drives some of my friends crazy. I try and not say it out loud all the time, but sometimes they're just like, what are you talking about? Like, this makes no sense whatsoever. But sometimes they amuse me and they're like, okay, fine, tell us about this. But I think that's kind of one thing where you just look at the world and you start to see things that you didn't notice before. Yeah, I think the major is going to get you through the door, right? They're going to get a lot of applications and they want to figure out, like, is this person serious? Like, can they do the job? So I think to that extent, the major really matters. What I would take from it beyond that is like, nobody hires a resume, right? Like companies always hire people, not resumes. And so what you really need is you need like a persuasive narrative for why you're the right person for the job. And some of that can relate to your major, but some of it can also just be like, your other experiences, right? Maybe maybe have done an internship in a very different field. And now you can connect it to what they're doing. But they're either doing in accounting or certain kind of consulting, right? Like maybe you have some experience working on a factory floor. Just actually doing manual labor on the factory floor, right? And now you're going to consulting and say like, well, I understand exactly what happens on the factory floor. All these other consultants you have, they have never seen it, right? Maybe they've studied in a textbook, but they don't even know how to talk to the people who work on factory floors. I have that experience. And so that might be a way where you never think working in a factory will benefit you for a consulting job, but it can if you have like a story to go with it, right? You need to be able to persuade the other person that you have the right skill set. And I think, one way you can go about that is like you can have it all planned out in advance, and then you study exactly the things that help you. But I think nobody actually does that. I think whenever people have these very persuasive stories, they completely made them up after the fact, right? In fact, this is even true for like professors. When we apply for jobs, we have to submit what's called like a research statement. And so basically we share our research philosophy. We kind of put all the papers we've written, all the work we've done into like one coherent story, right? And that's not how research works. That is not how you come up with ideas. That's not, things don't work out, other things work out. You have a friend who's doing something, you're like, oh, let's do that together. But then you have to sit down and actually write the statement, and it becomes an exercise in storytelling, right? You say like, oh, here are these things that come together. And that's not how it was planned. That's not how it was intended. But when you think about it, it actually kind of makes sense, right? It's not deceptive or dishonest. It's just a way of reframing a story. And so I think you want to do the same in any kind of interview or any kind of application. Like you take all the skills you have and you tell a story around it and for why you're the right person for this. And so, yeah, that could be different internships, that can be different majors. But you still need one thing to get you through the door. Like someone at the company actually has to look at your resume, or they have to invite you out for an interview. And that's kind of where grades, I think, also factor in, at least a little bit. I don't think nearly as much as people think. Oh, that's a great question. I think it depends a little bit on what the source is. So if you can't change your major because of some academic restrictions or requirements, you might be stuck with the major you have, right? But I think it doesn't stop you from taking other classes in related majors, right? And then you can kind of, as I mentioned, like you recraft the narrative. You tell the story around this other side. Maybe in terms of your transcript, it's not your main focus, but you make it your main focus. Right? Your major is management. You have some marketing classes. You want to get into marketing, write it up, right? Brand yourself as a marketing person who knows how to manage teams of people and who's familiar with the management literature, right? Like to some extent, again, this is storytelling, right? You just have to be persuasive. So I think that's sort of one part where I wouldn't even worry all that much about like what the major on your transcript is if that's the problem. Just try and do as much of the sort of the area you want as you can, or as the system lets you, right? You have to work with some constraints. If you're thinking about external pressures like family members or other people, I had like this one experience when I was an undergraduate student. I went to this big conference in economics, right? And I was like super excited to learn about all the research that people presented. And then we had this lunch, and the person next to me was like this older professor, and he was like, "Oh, what are you interested in?" He was like, "Very nice." I said, "Oh, like I want to study behavior. I'm like really interested in behavioral economics." And he kind of looked at me and said, like, "Yeah, that's interesting. That's okay. But I feel like all the interesting things in that field have already been done." And that was like 10 years ago. And since then, this field has like massively grown. And I can tell you, like, I don't have half the time to do the things, I don't have the time to do half the things I really want to do. So that person's prediction was completely off. But you will often find that, people around you have very strong feelings about things, but even if they don't understand them very well. And so you kind of have to make two assessments there. It's like, first, how informed is this person? Like, does this person actually know what they're talking about? In which case, you should take the advice more seriously, right? But maybe this is someone who just like is very confident about things they don't know much about, which I think describes almost all of us. I think all of us in some situations, right? We tend to be convinced that something is right, and then we have to think about why are we convinced? It turns out, we don't actually have that much evidence to back up. So to some extent, you may just need to you may need to evaluate how much should you actually listen to someone. The other thing, though, is that say you want to go into consulting, and the advice you're getting is here's how to get there. That can actually be very informative, right? And that might be the kind of thing where you end up changing your decisions. But if someone says, oh, you shouldn't do consulting, go become a lawyer instead, right? Or go do this other thing instead. Now, that's not necessarily career advice. That's more like a disagreement about preferences. So they might just think like some other job or some other career is better for you. And that's not something anyone can make. Like, that's not a decision anyone can make on your behalf, right? Like, you have your preferences. There are things you value and care about, and you should optimize those. Like, don't optimize what someone else thinks. So, if someone thinks you should really have a job that's super secure and it doesn't matter if it doesn't pay that much, but you can never get fired kind of thing, right? That's a very different career from going into, say, consulting, where your odds of getting fired might actually be pretty high, but then it also pays well. It's very stressful. There's a lot of travel, but maybe you like that. And maybe other people really hate traveling. And so they would tell you, don't do this career. And so you have to separate that as well, right? Are they actually imposing their preferences onto you, right? Are they just telling you what will make them happy? In which case, ignore it completely, right? That's never going to work. Or are they trying to help you to maximize what your preferences are? So do they recognize, okay, you're like this, here's how you can get there. And that kind of advice, I think, is a lot more valuable. Yeah, that's interesting. So I think in terms of like just economics broadly, I think there's a big myth of like, people are irrational, right? That's kind of like behavioral economics is all, oh, people are irrational. They, they're crazy doing things out there that the model doesn't predict. And that's kind of one thing I really don't like. And part of it is like, when your model is qualitatively wrong, the problem is not with the people in the world. The problem is with your model. Right? So the first thing you have to do is you have to fix your model, not all the people in the world. But the other thing is that irrational kind of implies that people are just out there doing crazy things. And that's not actually what's true, right? People have a logic to the things they do. It's just there's something that we're missing, and that's why we can't explain that behavior. So like if you think that people are only very selfish, it becomes very hard to imagine like why they're out there volunteering or donating. When you see that people actually care about the well-being of others and they feel pain, right, if someone else is suffering, it suddenly makes a lot of sense why people help others, right? It's no longer a mystery. And so trying to resolve this, I think, is very valuable. And I think it's, the problem is never with the people, right? Another, I think, concern can be that like these economic models or just models in general are kind of too simple. Right? It's like, oh, they miss all the richness in the world. And I kind of just made an argument for that, but I think you can also take it a bit too far. Because the idea of a model is always to be simpler than the world you're studying, right? You're trying to take something that's really complex and condense it down to the essence. So like think about Econ 101, right? A supply and demand model. It's the easiest thing, like the simplest thing in the world. It doesn't capture any complexity that's out there in terms of bargaining, in terms of whatever demands that people have, right? Competing interests, none of that is in there. It's just, here's a price, the price goes up, more supply, less demand, right? But it explains so much. It tells you why rent control doesn't work. Like you can apply it to so many settings and draw rich inferences from it. So, I think that it's not always better to have more complexity, right? In the worst case, you end up with a model that's as complex as the real world, and then you haven't really learned anything, right? What's the point of the model? Yeah, in terms of ethics, I think we often think of Well, as I tell in my class, right, there's this group of people, they call them the effective altruists. And they're basically people who take sort of a very methodological view about charity or donations, right? They really try and figure out, where do I have a big impact? And it just turns out like people don't like them. So they're actually very effective. They tend to have, where they go, they tend to have a big impact of the world. They're often very generous. They give a lot of money to these causes, but people just have the sense of like, charity and donation should always be like something you do emotionally. It shouldn't be something you do like deliberate with a goal. And so I think that's maybe another myth, right? That's something that I think is actually kind of harmful, right? Because you want to make a big impact. You should care that you do something good in the world, and you should not fault people because they care about their impact, right? That's counterproductive, right? Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's like a tension that a lot of people face. That you kind of have this thing you're really passionate about, but then maybe you think it doesn't pay well and there's another career that can, pay a lot more. And I will just say, like, having a higher salary actually can make you happy too, right? Like there's this belief, maybe that's another myth, that, like more money doesn't make you happier. There's probably some limit to it, but it definitely helps. I mean, like most, and just you can think of this as almost like a revealed preference thing. There are very few people in the world who give up their salary and say, like, just pay me half as much. Like people seem to prefer earning more money, right? And I think there's actually very good reason for that, because you can do a lot more things, right? And so that should factor into your decision, right? But there's going to be limits to that. So part of why I think that it's not necessarily like a contradiction or a trade-off is like, what actually makes you be passionate about something? And I don't think that's like an easy thing to figure out, right? There's lots of things you could be doing, and some things you enjoy more and some things you enjoy less. But if you think about why you enjoy something, I don't think it's obvious, but I think what really drives enjoyment is actually being good at it, right? And maybe it sounds like, kind of banal, right? It doesn't sound like very insightful, but think about this, right? If it's something you're very good at, what it means is you get a lot of positive feedback. Like you do better than other people, you recognize your own expertise. It feels good, right? Rather than just failing all the time, you actually, you struggle sometimes. Nothing is always easy, right? But in general, you do well. And so now imagine what it takes like to be really good in any career you choose, right? You actually have to be good at what you do. Like it doesn't matter what major you pick, you will never have a successful career if you just hate doing it and you're not good at it. And so I think that's why it's not necessarily a contradiction. So I think if you do something you're very passionate about, it will be much easier for you to actually be good at it. You're going to sort of a self-reinforcing thing, right? You're good at it, you become passionate, you get positive feedback, people admire you for it. And so now you enjoy it even more, you get better at it. It's like when you talk to people who are, really successful accountants, they tell you they love being accountants. And, maybe there's some people who really love being accountants, but it just does not, to me, sound like the most exciting job in the world. But what I think they really enjoy is being an expert in accounting. Like people will come to them with problems that are actually very interesting, right? And say like, can you help us solve it? And then, you spend 6 months or whatever, you consult on something and you figure out the solution to their problem. And that part, I think, is going to feel super enjoyable. And you could be doing this in accounting, you could be doing this as an economist, you could be doing this in marketing, like, any kind of industry you could do this. But the fact that people demand your services, right? They call you up as the expert and you can do something about it. I think that's what's super rewarding. And so I think like separating the actual act of the task you're doing from what it feels like to be in a career where you're very good at that task. I think those are sort of two separate things. I would say like, if you really hate doing something, don't do it. Like it's just, it's setting you up to be unhappy all the way along it. And then you end up in a career where you have to do more of it, which is not great either. And then I think, people tend to get bitter or they just tend to be unhappy. And that's also not setting you up for a very successful career. So yeah, definitely consider your passions. maybe one note as well
So,
is that, you can separate your work from your hobbies, right? Like there are potentially things that you really enjoy doing, but you wouldn't want to have as a career. So one thing I really like doing is programming. I do it for my research. I feel like I get stuck on something and then I spend 5 hours finding like a typo in my code, and it's frustrating and it's miserable for 5 hours. But then the thing runs and it just feels so deeply satisfying to get it to run that I'm like, oh, I really enjoy this. But I would never want to do this as my career. I think I would be so frustrated. I would like hate every moment of it. But in small doses, it's a lot of fun. Yeah, in the US, unfortunately, law is a graduate degree. So unfortunately, I could not choose it as a minor. Otherwise, I think I would have. I mean, I'm still interested. And actually, when I was at Harvard, I audited one of their law classes, which was super fun. It was basically on rhetoric and how to be persuasive. And yeah, anyway, highly, highly recommend those kind of classes. They're like super fun. And the reason I recommend, I do think like you should get a minor of some sort. So at least you should take some classes outside of your major. It's just because like it's good to have a core competency, right? You want to have some area where you're expert in and where you really know your stuff. But then it kind of helps to know some things about adjacent areas. So maybe, something that you can connect to what your major is, but isn't something that everyone else in the world is also doing. Because in some way, it makes you a way more interesting job candidate, right? You can come up and say like, oh, I know all these things, but there's this other thing I know. And your 100 other applicants for this job, they don't know that thing. And so then if you can convince the employer that this thing is actually worth knowing and they really need to hire someone who knows that thing, you suddenly become a market of one kind of thing, right? Like you don't want to be one candidate out of 100. You want to be one candidate out of one. It's like, okay, great. Everyone knows accounting, but I also know, I don't know, data science, right? Well, artificial intelligence is a big thing in accounting. So you should have someone who is conversant in artificial intelligence, let's say. How many candidates do you have? Probably not a whole lot. And suddenly you become that one person, right, who's very interesting. And then an employer might say, yeah, you know what? That's what I didn't know it, but now I know that this is what I want. And then you have a lot more bargaining power, because now it's not about, who takes the lowest salary or something. Now they want you specifically. And it's always a good, like it's good to be in a position where someone wants you specifically and not just any candidate with a certain skill set. So that's why I would recommend like pick a minor or some specialty and try and make it something that's adjacent. So it's something that's relevant for your career goals, but try and find something that other people aren't doing, right? So you have the specialization for a particular skill, but then you have this diversification on top of it where you become, a market of you, right? Yeah, so when I started university, I was really interested in doing research, but I also knew absolutely nothing of, what it's like to do research, or, what it's like to be a professor. I had no idea, right? But actually, my very first year of college, I spent 2 weeks in Guangzhou. And it was a study abroad kind of like visit related to, what was the title? Something like China and the US in the era of globalization or something. And so there were maybe 10 students from my university and 10 local students, right, from Sun Yat-sen University. And so the 20 of us basically were just hanging out for 2 weeks, seeing all these lectures from different faculty. And then we came for 2 days to Hong Kong. That was the one time I'd been to Hong Kong before taking this job. And like I even then like loved the city, right? It was just like, I remember the light show like that now I see every night. So, it's still very cool. I love light shows. So this is great for me. But even seeing it then, it was like super impressive. And so I would never have thought that I would work here one day. But, life works out in strange ways. I mean, I think the people around me are a strange reference group because they're mostly professors, at least around here. And so like I think we love doing what we do because like we have a lot of freedom in terms of what we actually do, right? Most of my year, right, is doing research. So I teach only in the spring this class, and the rest of the year is research. And what does that mean? It means, do whatever you want and whatever you think is interesting, right? I see something in a grocery store, that can be 6 months of my year. It's usually not, but right, it could be. In terms of my friends who are not in academia, I think many of them really, actually, I think most of them really did something related to their passion. They started off, like saying journalism, and then they get good at it. They were good at it, but then they start to expand into other things. Like they become, they become editors. So they start managing a team of people, and then the salary goes up as well, right? As you sort of have a career, your income will go up. I have a friend who's an artist, and that does not pay well. But then she became a paralegal, and she's really, really good as a paralegal. And so that is kind of now her main job, is actually immigration law in the US. And then as an artist, that's what she's doing on the side. And then, as her paintings are shown in galleries, she can maybe shift more and more of her time into being an artist when it becomes sort of a way, right, to finance her living. But I think, maybe speaking to that, like whatever you choose as your initial job doesn't have to be your lifetime career objective, right? So if you find, I don't know, you go into accounting and eventually, maybe initially you kind of like it, maybe eventually you don't like it as much anymore. There are other fields, right? Maybe you become a lawyer and your skills as an accountant aren't wasted. It's not like, you've wasted all these years becoming a good accountant. No, now there's a new specialty for you, right? Maybe now you do some kind of corporate law that can actually benefit from your accounting skills. So I think as long as you're open to branching out, whatever you do initially doesn't have to be the thing you do all your life. Okay, well, first of all, again, thank you. This is so lovely to hear. I really appreciate that. Why HKUST and not other places? Obviously, we're the best business school here, right? Let's be honest. We're number one, so that one. But generally, like why here? So the way it works if you want to become a professor is it's actually a very organized market, at least for business schools. So it's not that you kind of just try and see, when or job postings coming up, but there's actually kind of like a cycle that the whole world is on the same timeline. So around the beginning of the fall, you see the job postings go up and you send your application to, depends on which area you're in, but maybe between like 30 and 100 universities or something, right? You submit all your materials, your transcripts, your research, all that kind of stuff, right? And then you do some interviews, you present your research to the group, and then eventually you hopefully get some offers and you make a decision. But it's all like on a synchronized timeline, right? So it kind of happens in one movement. And so I actually have two friends of mine who are here at HKUST already. So Brad Biddley, who is also a professor in management, actually both in management. So I met him when I spent some time at Wharton, so that's where he does his PhD, and then Professor Martha Zhang, who got her PhD at Harvard. So we overlapped there. So I've known them, and they're like both super, super fun and cool people. And I was like, oh, like the idea of working with them is great. And actually, Martha's office is right next to mine, so even better. So I was like, oh, I get to work with them. That sounds cool, right? I should definitely apply. Even if maybe, I didn't really think of moving to Hong Kong. I was like, oh, sure, right? I mean, you kind of apply everywhere in the world, and then you see later what shakes out, and then you kind of make your decision. But so one thing you also do is you actually go and present your research to the department. And so every professor and actually all the PhD students join on a Zoom call, and you talk about one specific research project that you're applying with. And so when I did that, I got all these like amazing questions. And so from people who are not just in my specialty area, right? People from all kinds of adjacent fields, even people who would not otherwise think about my kind of work, and they asked great questions. And like one of the things that's just most satisfying as a researcher is when people are engaging with what you're talking about and they're like giving you feedback, they're critically thinking about something. And that just made it a super fun experience. Whereas it's like, if you present somewhere and there's like no questions and you kind of wonder if your audio has gone out, that's not enjoyable, right? Or that's just a lot harder to get excited about. So when you see all this enthusiasm, you're like, I want to be part of that crowd, right? That is a fun place to be. And so basically that ended up really driving the decision. It's not at all confidential. Yeah, I would love to. I mean, one of the things that's just it's just been amazing about teaching the class is the level of engagement the students have, right? Like as I said at the beginning, right? This is a required class. You kind of didn't get to choose it. You're stuck with it, and so your sense might just be like people come and they don't want to do it. They don't want to have anything to do with this, right? But then to see the engagement, the critical thinking about all the topics. I mean, we have an amazing group of students here. Again, including people on this very screen. So yeah, that kind of makes, that makes it worth teaching in some ways, right? That makes it really fun. And then absolutely, I mean, it would be such a pleasure to do research with you guys. Yeah. Yeah, I think there's actually a lot more commonalities. So I think like, it's hard to say like how people differ that much. Like in general, you have your core group of people that are very engaged, like participating, they're like really thinking along, and that's like, you engage a lot. So I think, yeah, a lot of commonalities in that sense. And the last group I was sort of a teaching fellow for, they were master students at Harvard, right? So they were all in the public policy program. So they were like a bit older. They were, I think, mostly in their like mid-30s or so. And so they've come in with more career advice. But actually, other than that, I think, there's not a big difference. So one thing I've noticed with the students here is you actually, I think, are more prepared. Like people here really do the readings, which I'm very excited by, right? Even though I apologize, some of them I know are pretty long. It has not been lost on me. But yeah, so, I think like people here come very prepared. So I think that's like one way that teaching here at HKUST is in some ways a little bit nicer, right? Like you have people come in prepared. It's a lot easier to have conversations and discussions, and you have to spend less time reviewing material and the readings. Otherwise it's just duplicating things. One thing that the students at Harvard were doing differently, although again, some of this is because they were like in their 30s, right? I think they were much more willing to share opinions that weren't like fully thought through. So like, sometimes you ask a question in a class, right? And then there's a minute of silence while people form their opinion and they try and reason it through. And then you get someone to raise their hand, and they give a really well formulated answer, and it's usually correct and it hits all the points. And I mean, that's good, right? In some ways that's good. But in some ways you also kind of want to see the immediate gut reaction, right? It's like, there's a question, hand already goes up. The person hasn't even heard the entire question yet, right? You're still asking the question, but the person's already ready to answer. And then they will say whatever the first thing was that come to mind. And it's probably not correct, but it's the starting point of the conversation. You can be like, okay, why is this an intuition? Now that we have time to think about it for more than 30 seconds, like what's the second answer? And so that I think can often help with a conversation. So I'd encourage all of you, like, it's okay to be wrong, right? When you're giving answers, or when professors in all your classes, I imagine, ask questions, they're totally fine with you giving the wrong answer. It's not, it's not a bad sign, right? It's often very interesting to see what the first thing is that comes to mind. Yeah, I think I have to confess that I was that person who was always close to the deadline. That was definitely me. And then I tried to be better by setting earlier deadlines for the group. And it worked with, I think, mixed success. Sorry to all my former group mates. I think one thing I've learned after doing group projects that I wish I had sort of realized more at the time is that like I have a tendency to sort of be like a perfectionist. So I will spend a lot of time thinking about very small things. And that kind of works if you don't have a deadline, but it absolutely does not work if you're trying to coordinate with people and there are deadlines coming up. And then half your group doesn't actually want a perfect score, right? They're okay just submitting anything. And then you get some email at 2 in the morning and you wake up at 2:30 so you can edit that person's writings. I've definitely done that because like I didn't want us to submit something that had grammatical errors. And I think what I should have taken away from that is like, sometimes good enough is good enough, which I know may not be the most satisfying answer, but I do actually think it's true, right? Like any time in the world when you work with people, there's going to be different levels of investment from different people. And you kind of have to reach some consensus of like, what are you going to target as the outcome of this project? And I think it helps to have this conversation up front. Like if you realize, for example, in my class, right, you get to pick your group mates. So if you find that like one person just doesn't care about their grades, they can be a good friend, but maybe they should not be in your group. Or you assign them something that is less critical, right? They do some other task that you don't think is like the most important part. Like if there's someone who's not really invested in the grade, don't let them do the final thing where they put all the pieces together. It's going to work out terribly, right? Give them some modular task that you can kind of just attach at the end to the project. But I think in general, actually communicating with people and sort of being very upfront about like, what are everyone's expectations about the project? Like, what are the goals? How much time is everyone willing to contribute? And then sort of assigning tasks based on that. I think that is probably a good way to go about it. And potentially like having these conversations, if you can, before you form the group. Might be a little bit too late now, but going forward for other projects, right? And then sometimes in the real world, you're just not able to pick your teammates. Like you just get a group together and you have to make it work. And that's actually one thing that group projects are also meant to teach, right? It's sort of never, I think it's almost never explicitly stated, but this is such a common thing in the world. Like, doesn't matter what company you work for, right? Different people have different investments, they have different career goals. And so you can't expect everyone to be equally motivated, especially not equally motivated to the top, the top students, right? By definition, there's a range of motivation. If you're at the extreme high end, most people will be below you. And that's just some way you have to manage that. I wish I could say yes, but I think no, definitely not. Part of it is like, like there's some research, for example, on how people always underestimate how long things take. And this is called the planning fallacy. It's just like whatever plan you have, you underestimate the time. And it turns out there's no cure for it. Even people who are well aware about the planning fallacy, they still commit it. You're like, oh, it's going to take me 20 hours, or it's going to take me, a week. I'm just going to tell my colleagues it's going to take me 10 days, but I can almost guarantee you it's going to take more than 10 days, right? No matter how you do the time estimate. I think what being a management professor does is you can send an email to your colleague that's just like planning fallacy and the smiley face, and they know exactly what happened, right? I think you just have like a jargon term to describe what happened to you, but no, still no real way to avoid it. I do actually think that, I don't think it's been as a result of management, but just in general, I found like time boxing to be the most effective thing in the world, which is basically just where you put on your calendar, like, say a 2-hour block to write the introduction for something, or 1-hour block to do a certain reading, but actually just put it on your calendar. And I think that's like so powerful because you then sit down and actually do it. And that's often the hardest part. It's just actually sitting down and getting started. At least for me, that's often the hardest part. I remember I spent some brief time at Google doing sort of a little bit of a consulting thing. And one of the things we kind of really tried to do, but never ended up actually doing, was just an experiment where we gave people calendars and like force them to put everything on their calendar or pay them to put everything on their calendar, whatever, just to see like how much of an effect that has. So like, I don't know if you've ever sold things on Carousel or something. This might actually be less of a, I feel like people in Hong Kong have better time management. But in the US, you sort of try and sell things on Craigslist or something, and people are like, oh, I will come pick it up at 4 o'clock. And then like at 7 p.m., you get a text message that says something, oh, forgot about this, I can come tomorrow. And then, there's probably a good chance they forget about it tomorrow too. And they just don't use calendars, like their lives are unscheduled. And in some ways I envy this, but it's completely impossible to get anything done like that, right? Versus I think students, this was definitely true at Harvard, but I imagine it's here also true. It's like people really schedule their days and their lives, right? Everything is somehow on a calendar. I remember there was this one undergraduate who wanted to meet with me. This was in Boston, and she scheduled a coffee 2 weeks out. That was the first opening on her calendar. And I was just like, well, my first life advice is like, you need to open up your calendar, right? That is a very, very busy schedule, but that was just normal. And she said, like, unless she schedules everything on a calendar, like nothing gets done and nothing happens. So calendars are maybe the one intervention I very much believe in, but I'm not aware of actual research showing that it works. So yeah, if you're looking for an undergraduate research project, maybe figuring out how to do that study is, is an idea. Yeah, thank you. I think that connects a little bit to what I mentioned, like in terms of just the slides. And the reason you're seeing the things I'm very passionate about is because basically everything else got deleted, right? If I bore myself, it's got to go. So I think that's sort of maybe the secret to this, right? I'm teaching it for the first time, so it's actually kind of new to me too. And it's some way of like learning about something that I think is actually interesting and like high stakes, right? So this is very much like the kind of like passion or the heart-driven approach to research. Now, there are people who will tell you not to do this as a new professor. They will tell you, right, you should have a good research agenda. There should be projects you should be finishing and working on, and don't do this other thing that sounds fun in the moment. That is probably good advice, and it's advice I've never taken. So like, I just can't do it, right? If I'm interested in a project, it's very easy for me to wake up and work on it because I'm like, I wonder what happened, right? I'm like really curious to find out the answer. And if I lose that curiosity, it's very hard for me to do anything. There's like projects, that have been 98% completed for like 2 years. And it's really like, I could probably spend 1 day on it and it would be done. But I haven't managed to like get myself to do it. Which is something I should be, maybe I need to put this on my calendar somehow. Yeah, so I think, it's, yeah, it's easier to be passionate about something when you get to choose what you want to teach, right? When you get this flexibility and this freedom. And it's definitely one thing that has made me want to become a professor. It's this just sort of like randomness of, interested in how people behave, what it is they do. And then you think about something and suddenly someone else says like, this is interesting, like you should do that, or what do you think if we tried this? And suddenly you come up with like really crazy experiments, some of which you never end up running, but then some of which you kind of keep having in the back of your head and be like, wouldn't this be fun? Like I had this conversation with a friend at one point where we're trying to figure out whether alcohol makes people more receptive to like opposing political views. And the kind of idea is, so Switzerland used to have this debate show where, like in the 80s, where people would actually drink alcohol on live TV while they're debating politics. And the journalists from that time at least say, like, you can tell as the show went on, right, and people got more drunk, they actually started getting more respectful of other people. And so, you're like, okay, but it turns out, like, imagine you're trying to figure out how are people receptive to views that disagree with their own, right? You could say, well, maybe it actually takes effort to listen to someone who has a different view. You kind of have to introspect, you have to figure out what are they thinking, where are they coming from? And then it takes effort to pay attention to a different view. On the other hand, you might say it actually takes effort to block out opposing views, right? Maybe it actually takes effort to defend yourself against information that contradicts what you think. And whichever way you go, right, either it takes effort to keep your perspective or to defend your view, or it takes effort to adopt another position. And totally the way to solve this is by getting people drunk and having them debate politics, right? Like, that is totally the way to do this and figure it out, which is very fun to design an experiment around this, and then largely very difficult to actually run it. So right before COVID happened, we actually wanted to go to a music festival where we would have tried to pull this off by basically surveying people. So you kind of imagine people who go to a music festival where they drink a lot of beer or a lot of alcohol, they get progressively more intoxicated. And so it should matter if you ask them these survey questions or if you have them argue at the beginning of the concert or towards the end of the concert, right? So that could have kind of been the experiment. And somehow we actually got, like, organizers of this huge festival in the Netherlands interested in this. And we were really, kind of hoping to run this. But it started off as complete absurd, like, brainstorming, right? And a lot of these projects never work out. And then other projects, you're just like, maybe we're going to have big music festivals in the near future. Maybe we should try that again, right? So again, undergraduate research projects. Yeah, absolutely. I'm still exactly, so this is maybe overly honest for the interview, but I'm still trying to figure out what exactly, like, management is. And this is very funny because when I was applying for this job, I was telling my friends, if I get this job, I'm going to have an answer to that question. And I got the job, but I still don't quite have an answer to the question. And the best answer I always give to people is everything that's fun and that involves dealing with other people. And if it's not fun, it helps you figure out how to make it fun and productive, right? So that's sort of my sense of management. Is like, can you work with other people? Can you get other people to do the things you want them to do? Or can you sort of influence them? That kind of thing, right? And if that's what you take as management, which I actually think is actually a fairly reasonable way to describe the field, then suddenly everything, right, kind of becomes management related. So in terms of what I would read, so I have some friends who insist on reading the Wall Street Journal and some friends who insist on reading the New York Times. And whatever they tell me, I always tell them to read the other thing, because I really think you should read both. It's in fact what I do, right? I always try and find an article on the same topic in both newspapers, because what you see is, like, they're both pretty mainstream, right? They're not like conspiracy, like, news sources, right? They have well-researched articles, but you quickly realize they have a different slant. So they take different perspectives on the same issue. And you only realize it when you read them both. So there was, like, this big issue in the US where there was a ban on evicting people during COVID. And so you couldn't kick renters out of their homes, basically. And then that ban was expiring. So the New York Times had this lengthy article talking to renters and how they're worried about getting evicted. And you read it and you're like, this is a serious problem, right? I can't imagine being in this position with a family and I may lose my home. This is, like, terrible. And then you read the Wall Street Journal and they talk to landlords who are basically going bankrupt. And they're like, oh, we're not getting any rent payments. The bank still wants us to make payments on mortgage, but we have no money. Like, if we can't kick these people out and get renters who start paying, we're going to lose the house and they're going to get kicked out anyway. And so I wouldn't say that either one of those articles fully describes the world, right? You kind of have to read them both in order to get that sense. So I think, yeah, definitely try and read more than one source, but try and read the same article from more than one source. So you actually become attuned to how they differ and where the difference is. In terms of podcasts, maybe that's a good example I can give you. There's one by NPR, which is the public radio in the US, and it's called Planet Money. And it's basically introducing basic economic concepts, but in like some kind of current real world event, right? Or they really try and make it like a fun experience. So they actually had a mini series, I think it was like 3 episodes, where they launched a satellite into space, or they launched something on a satellite into space. And so across the episodes, you kind of get to learn about this booming business of launching satellites, and how there's, how there's a satellite floating over the Walmart distribution centers. So Walmart is a really big retailer in the US, and there's satellites over on top of these distribution centers counting the number of trucks that go in and out. And so basically that way you can estimate what their shipping rates are, and so you can estimate demand in the economy. Right, and you can actually fairly well predict consumer sentiment and GDP growth and all these kind of things. So it explains economic concepts, but in like a really applied and fun way. So that's one of my favorites. I still listen to this. Like, even if you know the concepts, the application is often like super novel or interesting. A second podcast I would recommend is Ezra Klein. He's from the New York Times, and he has this like hour-long podcast. I think it's like maybe once a week or something, and he interviews people. But he's like a really, really good interviewer. He's like super smart, and he talks to people across different fields. So one of the recent ones, I think it was the end of February. So I feel like when people recommend podcasts, it's always like, go listen to these 10,000 episodes, all of which are an hour long, and nobody does it, right? But so if you only listen to one, I would listen to that one. He talks to a philosopher about the enjoyment we get from playing games. And it seems like initially maybe that has nothing to do with management, right? Like, what on earth does a philosopher playing board games and video games, like what does that teach us? But very quickly he talks about like, what's the idea? Like, why do we find games satisfying? It's because they give us a set of rules and they give us points to maximize. So like in our daily lives, we don't get points. We don't have a way of maximizing things. We have to figure out ourselves what we want to do. A video game is great at telling you exactly what to do and giving you positive reinforcement when you do it well. So it's this kind of thing we lack in the real world, right? And turns out has huge implications for management. How do you reward workers? There's a whole industry of gamification. But it even talks about things like social media, right? So you post something on Instagram, let's say, you get likes. That's a reward system. Someone designed a reward system because you like getting likes. And so you post more content that gets you likes. And so it turns out you become incentivized by a reward system, almost as if it were a video game. And so they basically reason through this and say like how this can actually affect discourse that we have in the world, how we can create polarization. And it's not that anyone deliberately thought this through, right? This was not the goal to create polarization. It's just the way the incentive system is built up, that's actually the consequence of doing it. And so, how we need to think carefully about designing rewards. And of course, that is very much at the heart of management, right? How do you get employees to pursue the goal that you have for them? You have to design an incentive system. And then if you don't do it well, you end up with people doing all kinds of unethical behaviors, right? Because they maximize the incentive they get. And you don't want them to do it, but you didn't reason it through, or you missed something. And so I think like learning from games is kind of a cool way to think about that. Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, no, I definitely think it applies, right? In some ways, management really, as you say, is about relationships. And so, of course, we have relationships in our personal lives, right? I think one concept that comes to mind is this idea of diversification, right? It's huge in finance. You want to spread your risk. You want to have different investments in different products. I think we should think about this in terms of our friends as well, right? You have different friends for different reasons, kind of things. So maybe you have one friend who you really like going to restaurants with, and then you have another friend who's a really picky eater. But maybe that picky eater is, a good friend for something else, right? They like the same kind of movies that you like. And so if you think about, I have a friend to go to restaurants with, and I have a friend to watch movies with, that's a lot more like, it's actually a lot better for relationships than if you try and get your picky eater to come to restaurants with you or watch movies with someone who has a very different taste, right? So like, why am I friends with this person kind of thing? And that's actually also something you want to evaluate, right? Over time, like we all change and the relationship we have with people change. It's maybe even most apparent with like our parents. So, when you live at home, you have a very different relationship with your parents that once you're, when you're gone for a few years, you come back, you visit, it's kind of a bit different. And so you have to reimagine what exactly the relationship looks like. And I think sort of thinking about that consciously and not just like thinking, oh, this is my friend. Why is my friend all weird now, right? Oh, why do I keep yelling at my parents now? Like, why don't we understand each other anymore? So actually sort of thinking through like what has changed and sort of this deliberate process can actually be very helpful, and it can lead to much better relationships. And it also kind of guards you against trying to have like one friend who's the best person for everything, right? I just actually don't think that's realistic. Even if we had someone who's exactly the same as we are, that would be boring, right? You want to have friends who are a bit different from you, so that creates excitement, that makes things interesting. And I would even apply this to like romantic relationships, right? Like your partner doesn't have to be the person who will do everything with you, right? There's you can sort of think similarly, like what are the things that we really enjoy doing together and that make us happy being together? And then what are things where we like different things, and so we go do those things with different people. So there's kind of like diversification, or thinking just as your friend group, as a group, rather than individuals, or trying to make one person everything. I think that can be kind of helpful. Personally, I mean, the biggest challenge, as you say, is distance. Especially if you travel around a lot, right? It's kind of hard to stay in touch. And so, I think probably similar to many of you, right? I use WhatsApp, I use an occasional like call, a video call. And sometimes you try and keep in touch more with some people, right? Especially the very close friends. You're trying to, it's difficult. It can be challenging. And then if you used to live in the same city or the same place, and now you live very far apart, it actually becomes difficult because you both go and make new friends. In some ways, right, you spend all the time you used to spend together with new people. And so it's kind of natural that you grow apart a little bit. And it's also a lot of peer effects, right? Like you become much more like your friends. And so that's how people also kind of drift apart. One thing I think that can be nice about distance is you get to see each other again, right? Certainly once we can do quarantine-free travel again, you can go visit all the friends you haven't seen in a while and just expect them to have changed, right? So they have new friends, their personality is going to have changed quite a bit, especially if it's been like 1 or 2 years since you've seen them. But that's kind of cool, right? Because you don't just want to have the friend you used to have many years ago, but in some ways you actually get to discover a new friend. You kind of get to discover someone who you're going to have things in common and who you're probably like almost surely, right, still get along with. But now they've had all these new experiences. And so they're going to be excited telling you about those, and vice versa, right? You get to tell them. And so I think it can actually be kind of really nice to see how your friends grow and develop too, right? And so what you can learn from each other. And in some ways, they can actually end up with much deeper friendships. And then maybe in some cases, you realize that you're actually not friends anymore. And I think that's also okay, right? It seems a bit cold, but sometimes I think that's the best for people, right? I think like some people try and be friends and then they get very angry at each other and they like just cannot understand each other anymore. And sometimes it's worth saying like, we used to be very close friends. Maybe now we're like acquaintances. It's still okay, right? People change and we all do. Oh, that's a big question. I think, I think embracing uncertainty. I think that's the one piece of advice I would give everyone is like, life is uncertain and that's okay. Like, don't try and plan out everything, right? Kind of, it's okay to be spontaneous and it's okay to be wrong. and to make mistakes and to sometimes course correct, right? So you do one thing, whether it's a field of study, a major, or any career goal, any personal goal, sometimes you realize that's really not for you. It's not just a momentary, like sometimes we all struggle, right? Sometimes we all hate what we do. That's normal. But when you find that it's persistent, there's something you really don't like about it, it's okay to change. Like, don't stick with it, right? That can be an opinion you hold. That can be something you pursue career-wise, personal-wise. And then change is difficult, right? There's this uncertainty. It can be scary. You don't know what to expect. But I think with the benefit of hindsight, we often tend to regret the things we didn't do much more so than the things we ended up doing. So in some of these cases, I would say, if it's just one day where you're really bored with something, see if if it just passes. But if it's really like a persistent thing, take the risk, accept the uncertainty, and you might actually find yourself in much better position, much happier for doing so. And even if not, you're going to have at least one interesting experience to add to your life, right? Like sometimes you do things and you're like, I should not have done that, right? That was kind of a waste, or that was a bad idea. But now you know, right? I mean, and it's never that bad. And I'm actually reminded of this. I think it's at Wharton, but there's one negotiation class where they have the students go to a gas station to negotiate a discount on gas prices. And it turns out there is like one thing you will never get anywhere in the world. You will never get a discount on gas prices because the gas station makes no money, basically, right? They're not going to give it to you at a loss. And everyone knows this, but they send them to a gas station to negotiate. And they usually get something, like they get some free chips, or they get a soda or chewing gum or something like really small. And the moral of that lesson, right, is kind of like, this is the worst negotiation you will have in your life. You entered there knowing you're not going to get what you wanted. You knew it was going to be miserable for both of you, and you survived it, right? And in fact, you may even have gotten something out of it that you didn't expect. And once you've sort of experienced that miserable sort of thing, and then you find it's actually not that bad. It wasn't nearly as bad as you thought it would be. And then going forward, people are much more willing to negotiate anything, right? Because they know it's never as bad as they think it is. And there's actually similar research in terms of political opinions. Like people think it's miserable to listen to someone from the, in the US at least, from the opposing political party. And then they actually have to do it. And they're like, oh, it wasn't that bad. Like that person's kind of nice. Like we disagree, but they're kind of nice. And so I think we often think the things we don't like to do are much more miserable than they end up being. And that's holding us back. So I think if you can somehow be aware of this and say, like, what's the worst that can happen, right? And be okay with that, I think you'll have some many, many more interesting experiences. With fun people, like I think anyone would enjoy getting these great questions from all of you. I don't actually think I have a life philosophy, to be honest. I think the try things you haven't done before, do the unexpected, the unusual, do something new. It's not going to be as bad. I think that's the closest I would have to a life philosophy. Maybe one, sort of related piece of advice is like, we often hear that we should care more about the future. So like, when you're in primary school, you study so you get into a good secondary school. In secondary school, you study very hard so that you get into HKUST. Now you all study very hard to get it. We always have these long-term goals, right? And we work very hard to get them. And then usually when we talk about policy problems, whether it's like people not saving enough or obesity or all these issues, we always say that like people are not thinking long-term enough. And that's a big focus, right? But it turns out there's this, by and large, unstudied problem that's actually the reverse. So when you look at people who are already retiring, they don't spend enough, right? They have all these savings built up, but then even after they retire, they still save a lot, or they don't spend nearly as much as they could. So there seems to be an opposite problem as well. It's like, are we sometimes thinking too much about the future? And so, if you think about the present and you find that whatever you're doing is not making you happy, it could actually be efficient to, focus more on the present. sort of this like live in the moment kind of view. One thing that I would, again, speaking of undergraduate research thing, one thing I would love to think sort of more about is like, what does enjoyment really tell us, right? So you can kind of think that our body is giving us all these signals, right? Like, for example, if you're bored at something, it's actually one of my co-authors has this very cool economic model of boredom and flow. And he's basically making the argument that boredom is your body's way of telling you you're misdirecting your attention, right? Like attention is a very scarce resource. You only have so much of it. You can only pay attention to one thing. And if you're really bored, you're wasting your attention and you should go do something else. On the other hand, if you're like in the state of flow where everything goes by very easily, that's your body telling you keep doing this, right? This is a good use of your attention. So I actually wonder if enjoyment has kind of similar dimensions to it, right? Like if you really enjoy doing something, that's like, it's almost like your body or your brain or whatever you want, right? Telling you like, this is what you should be doing. You're good at